"Get away from my father's motorcycle." She said it without raising her voice. 6 words, flat and clear in the cold November air outside Coleridge, Alberta, and Celeste Moreau said them while standing alone in a gravel lot with a Tim Hortons coffee she hadn't even cracked open yet, facing 3 young men who had already done more damage to the 1989 Harley-Davidson Softail in the past 10 minutes than she could fully take in at once. The mirror was on the ground, her father's original chrome side mirror, lying in the gravel by the rear tire like something discarded. The front fender had a crease at the lower edge that hadn't been there when she'd parked. And the one in the middle, the tall one in the flat brim cap, the one the other two seemed to orbit, was crouching beside the gas tank with his key raised, dragging a scratch across the black paint that caught the parking lot lights in a thin, cold line. If you're new to this channel, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a comment below and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's ride. North Road Garage sat at the edge of Coleridge off Highway 36, a stretch of 2-lane blacktop that connected the town to the Trans-Canada about 12 kilometers east. It was the kind of shop that didn't advertise, didn't need to, because Emile Moreau's name had been on the deed for 31 years, and in that time the word had spread the way it always spreads in small towns, slowly, surely, mouth to mouth, until most people in and around Coleridge who needed real work done knew to pull onto the gravel lot and look for the light on over the bay doors. Emile had died 11 weeks earlier. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed in March, gone by August. He had not been old enough, had not been finished enough, but he had left Celeste the garage and the mortgage on it, and the 1989 Softail he'd been riding for longer than she'd been alive. And he had left her the specific knowledge of how every piece of equipment in that shop worked, and how every regular customer liked their vehicle handled. She had not bothered to hide it. She had been learning beside him since she was 14. She'd been doing the real work for the past 3 years, while he managed the bookkeeping with hands that shook more than they used to. She knew that garage better than she knew anything else in the world except grief, which she was still learning. She'd been inside 45 minutes. Long enough for a medium Tim's and a chicken wrap she didn't fully taste. Long enough for a conversation with the woman at the counter who had known Emile from the curling league and who didn't push when Celeste went quiet between sentences. She'd parked the Softail the way Emile always parked it, away from other vehicles, nose out, kickstand on the solid strip of asphalt near the hydro pole, not because she was precious about it, because that was what Emile had always done, and some habits outlived the people who taught them. She came out through the glass door and heard the laughter before she saw them. A specific kind of laughter, too loud, too sharp, carrying the energy of people performing for each other, egging something forward. 3 of them. The 4th she registered a half-second later, younger than the others, standing off to the side near the tailgate of a pickup, not laughing quite as hard. Celeste covered the distance at an even pace, not running. She never ran toward things unless she had to. The tall one in the flat brim cap stood up when she got close. He looked at her the way some young men look at a woman standing alone in a parking lot. Quick assessment, quicker dismissal. "Easy," he said, stepping back from the motorcycle and spreading his hands like he was presenting it to her. "Nobody said it was yours." "I parked it there 40 minutes ago," Celeste said. "I went inside for a coffee." The one with the phone, he'd had it raised since she crossed the lot, laughed softly and kept filming. The 3rd leaned against the rear fender like it was his. The youngest, standing off to the side, had already looked once at the mirror on the ground and looked away from it. Celeste noted all of this without telegraphing that she was noting it. The tall one was Brandon Kohler. She didn't know his name yet, but she would. He was 24 years old and carried himself like someone who had decided very early that confidence and entitlement were the same thing and had never been given a reason to understand the difference. Beside him, Dylan Ferris had his phone up and recording with the enthusiasm of someone who understood that the person behind the camera rarely takes the blame for what gets filmed. The 3rd, Scott Weller, had moved to the rear of the motorcycle and stood with the loose ease of someone accustomed to getting away with things. The youngest, Jamie Weller, Scott's younger brother, was the one standing slightly apart, the one who hadn't put the knife away because he hadn't had a knife in the first place. His involvement had mostly been his silence, which was a kind of participation he was still working out how to feel about. Then Celeste looked at the motorcycle. Emile Moreau had maintained that Softail for 3 decades. Every November, he'd bring it in from the cold and go through it bolt by bolt. Chain tension, brake lines, oil, every fastener checked by hand. He'd replaced the seat leather once, sourcing the material from a supplier in Saskatoon, because the original weight was something he refused to compromise on. The chrome on the pipes had 2 small imperfections on the right side from a piece of gravel that caught them on a ride to Banff in 2006, and Emile had called them the map and refused to have them polished out. "You don't erase the roads you've ridden," he'd said. The mirror was on the ground. The fender had a crease at the lower edge, The key scratch across the tank caught the parking lot light in a long, thin line. Celeste felt something move through her chest that was older and heavier than anger. She kept her face where it needed to be. That motorcycle belonged to my father, she said. He died 11 weeks ago. You want to keep filming? Go ahead. But you should understand what you've already filmed. Brandon looked at his friends. Dylan laughed softly behind the phone. Brandon looked back at her with an expression of theatrical confusion. Look, nobody told us it was anyone's. It was just sitting there. I told you 40 minutes ago when I parked it. We didn't see you park it. She reached into her jacket pocket and took out her phone. She didn't call 911, she called one person. The call connected after 2 rings, and she spoke for less than 15 seconds. Rex, it's Celeste. I'm okay. Someone's damaged my dad's Softail. I'm at the Tim's on Route 1 outside town. Come when you can. She hung up. Brandon watched her put the phone away. Something shifted in his expression. Not alarm exactly, but the small recalibration of a hand of cards when one you didn't expect turns up. Rex, he said, testing the word. Who's Rex? Celeste walked to the motorcycle. She crouched beside it. She picked up the mirror from the gravel and turned it over in her hands and looked at the clean brake where it had snapped from the mount. The chrome was cold. You should move your vehicle, she said, without looking at him. Why would we do that? She didn't answer. For 11 minutes, nothing happened. Brandon told a joke she didn't listen to. Dylan circled the bike with his phone, narrating quietly for an audience that didn't exist yet. Scott sat on the tailgate and looked bored. Jamie stood near the restaurant entrance with his hands in his jacket pockets and said very little. And once, when nobody was watching, looked at the mirror on the ground with the expression of someone whose better instincts hadn't been entirely drowned out yet. Celeste stayed crouched near the motorcycle. She wasn't praying. She was just being near it. She had learned a long time ago that sometimes the only thing you can offer something is your presence. At the 11-minute mark, Brandon said, I don't think your friend is coming. At the 13-minute mark, Celeste heard it. Not with her ears at first, but with the soles of her boots. A vibration moving up through the asphalt, the particular resonance of motorcycle engines, running in numbers, all approaching from the same direction, building from a distant pulse into something that settled in the sternum. Brandon heard it at the 14-minute mark. He looked toward the highway. The first headlights appeared at the far end of the access road. Then more behind them, and more behind those, a column of light that kept coming and kept expanding and showed no sign of stopping. They turned into the lot 5 at a time. Men and women in road-worn cuts and leather and faces weathered by long rides and complicated lives. Riders who had heard Harold Maguire's voice come through their phones 17 minutes earlier, with words that had put them on their seats without need for more explanation. They pulled in and shut their engines down one by one. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been. 30 riders, maybe more. The lot was full and then fuller. Brandon Kohler stood in the middle of it with the easy confidence entirely drained from his face, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time if he'd ever felt it at all. The specific discomfort of a person who has genuinely lost track of what is happening. The crowd parted. Harold Rex Maguire walked through the middle of them. He was 59 years old and built in a way that made his age hard to read. Wide through the shoulders, gray beard, sleeveless cut over a thermal even in November, because cold had never bothered him the way it bothered most people. He moved through the crowd without hurrying and without looking at Brandon or the others, because the others were not the most important thing in this parking lot. He came to Celeste. She had stood up when she heard him coming. She was still holding the mirror. Rex looked at her face the way you look at the face of someone you have known a long time, quickly, completely, without needing it explained. Then he looked at the motorcycle. He crouched where she had crouched. He ran one hand along the scratch on the tank, slowly reading it. He looked at the fender. He looked at the mirror in her hands. Emil's bike, he said, not a question. He knew this motorcycle. He'd ridden beside it in 2 provinces over more than 20 years. He knew the particular curve of its lines and the way Emil had run the bars slightly lower than stock and the 2 small imperfections on the right pipes that Emil had called the map. He knew this motorcycle the way you know a face you've sat beside at 100 different tables. Rex stood up. He turned toward Brandon Kohler. Brandon Kohler took one involuntary step backward. Rex didn't move toward him. He just looked at him. The look wasn't violent. It was something quieter than violence and considerably harder to navigate. The expression of a person who has already decided what they think and is in no particular hurry about what comes next. You do this, Rex asked. Brandon's mouth opened. I didn't ask what you were doing. I asked if you did it. One of the riders near the back said something low to the rider beside her. Neither of them laughed. Dylan Ferris had lowered the phone. The footage on it now existed in a context he was only beginning to understand, and the understanding was not comfortable. Jamie Weller was looking at the ground. Celeste stepped aside and called the RCMP non-emergency line. She gave her name and her location and a factual description of what had occurred and mentioned that there was recorded documentation of the incident. She was back in under 3 minutes. The crowd had not moved. Brandon Kohler had nowhere to go. Constable Andrea Bremer arrived at the 20-minute mark, faster than Brandon had predicted when he'd been confident about response times in this part of the county. She paused when she registered the number of motorcycles in the lot, then continued walking toward the scene without slowing down. "Who called?" she asked. "I did," Celeste said. Bremer looked at the motorcycle. She looked at the 4 young men. She looked at Rex, who gave her a brief nod that carried the weight of 2 people who had been in the same county long enough to have a history. Brandon talked. He explained things with the particular quality of someone reconstructing events with the awareness that footage exists. Dylan said very little. Scott said nothing. Jamie looked at Celeste for a long moment, at her face, at the way she was standing beside what remained of the thing her father had left her, and then he turned to Constable Bremer. "We damaged her property," Jamie said. "All 4 of us. I want to say that clearly." Scott looked at him sharply. "It's on the video," Jamie said. "It was wrong. All of it was wrong." For a long moment, the gravel lot on Route 1 outside Coleridge held the particular silence of something that is shifted, not resolved, not over, but changed in a way that couldn't be taken back. Because Tyler Knox had walked into a parking lot believing that the woman standing beside that motorcycle was alone. Brandon Kohler had walked into a parking lot believing the same thing, and the specific shape of how wrong he'd been was still in this moment becoming clear to him. The charges were filed the following morning. Constable Bremer had been thorough. Dylan's phone footage was precise and unambiguous. Timestamps, faces, the sound of the mirror hitting gravel, the key scratch documented frame by frame. A restoration appraiser in Calgary confirmed the Softail's documented value, and the combined damage to the tank, fender, and mirror put the total well above what any court in the province would treat as minor mischief. Celeste sat in the second row at the initial hearing and said nothing that wasn't asked of her, which was consistent with how she handled most situations that other people would have used to perform their grievance for an audience. The judge reviewed the footage. He looked at the 4 young men. He asked whether the victim had a preference regarding restitution and community service. Celeste stood. "Your Honor," she said, "I'd like the 4 defendants to complete their community service hours at North Road Garage, my shop outside Coleridge. I'd like them to work with their hands on actual mechanical repair, not just cleanup. I want them to understand what it costs to build something." The room went quiet. Brandon Kohler's court-appointed lawyer leaned toward him. Brandon's expression was the expression of someone who had prepared for one kind of consequence and was being handed a completely different one. The judge studied Celeste for a moment. "You understand these are the individuals who damaged your property?" "I understand that clearly, Your Honor." "And you're requesting they work in your facility?" "I want them to spend time on the other side of a mistake," Celeste said. "Breaking that motorcycle took them 10 minutes. I want them to have some sense of what the other side of 10 minutes looks like." The judge wrote something in his notes. The request was unusual but not outside his discretion. All 4 defendants agreed. Brandon agreed last, in the way someone agrees when they've exhausted every other option. A kind of agreement that means very little in the moment and occasionally grows into something real, given enough time and enough friction. Rex was in the courthouse parking lot when Celeste came through the doors. Leaning against his truck, arms crossed, having heard the outcome through channels that moved faster than official communication had any business moving. "You want them at your garage," he said. "Yes." He looked at her steadily. "Celeste, those boys cracked Emil's tank. I know what they cracked." She stopped and turned to face him. "If I just wanted them punished, I'd have taken the maximum and gone home. That's not what I want." Rex was quiet for a moment. "What do you want?" "I want them to know the actual cost," she said. "Not the legal cost, the real one. What it means to break something that took somebody years to build." Rex looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since she was 17 years old, with a combination of deep respect and mild exasperation that defines the relationship between people who care about each other and don't always agree. "All right," he said. He pushed off the truck. "You need anything from me?" "Not yet." "You'll ask when you do." "I'll ask when I do." The first Monday, none of the 4 were particularly pleased to be there. Brandon arrived in a truck that cost more than most of Celeste's equipment, which she noticed and didn't mention. He stood in the gravel lot and looked at the building with the expression of someone who has already decided to be contemptuous of a place. Dylan was behind him. Scott arrived separately. Jamie came last, paused in the doorway, and was the first one to say good morning. Celeste was already at the workbench. She didn't stop what she was doing when they came through the door. Brooms are on the left wall, she said. Brandon, you're sweeping the floor. Dylan, the parts bins along the east wall need sorting by type and size. Scott, the tool cabinet near the back window hasn't been organized since spring, Jamie. She looked at him. Come stand over here. Jamie walked to the bench. She was working on a motorcycle that had been partially disassembled with evident intention and left that way. Controls off, left side cluster disconnected, components laid out in an arrangement that was clearly deliberate. Do you know what adaptive controls are? She asked. Jamie looked at the parts. No. This belongs to a man named Pierre Levine. He had a spinal cord injury 2 years ago. His left side grip is at about half strength with reduced fine motor response. The standard clutch pull is more than he can apply reliably. She held up one of the components. So we rebuild the system to work with what he has instead of against it. Jamie looked at the part. He looked at the disassembled motorcycle. He looked at her. How long does that take? This modification? 2 sessions to design, about 5 hours to fabricate. When it's done, Pierre will ride again. He hasn't been on a bike since the accident. Behind them, Brandon swept with the particular energy of someone who considers sweeping beneath him, but has calculated that open resistance costs more. The scraping was louder than it needed to be. Celeste didn't mention it. By the end of the second week, the garage had found an uneasy equilibrium. Brandon did what he was asked and made clear through every available signal that he was counting down his hours. Dylan adapted faster. He had the natural flexibility of someone who reads the room and adjusts. And in this room, Celeste was the only person who knew what she was doing. Scott worked steadily once he had a task with a clear beginning and end. He took to the tool cabinet and reorganized it twice. By Thursday, it was cleaner than it had been in years. Jamie asked questions. Small ones at first. Celeste answered each one without making it a teaching moment, without performing patience, and that turned out to be exactly what made him want to keep asking. The shift in Brandon came quietly on a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week when George Ironside Pelletier stopped by. George had been coming to North Road Garage for 6 years. Everyone who knew him called him Ironside, a name that had come from the inside of the man rather than being placed on him, and it fit the way those names fit. He walked with a cane now, nerve damage from an old crash, not catastrophic but enough to make certain mornings long, and he wore it with the stoic humor of someone who has decided that the alternative to aging is worse. He came through the door, saw Brandon standing near the back of the shop, and looked at him the way he looked at most things, directly, without preamble. You're one of the ones, George said. Brandon straightened. I'm doing my community service hours. I know what you're doing. I'm saying you're one of the 4 who put their hands on Emil's bike. Brandon met his eyes. Yes. George set his cane against the bench and pulled up a stool. You know what that motorcycle is? He asked. It's her father's. It's more than that. George looked at the Softail which sat in the corner of the shop waiting. 12 years ago, I was told I'd never ride again. Nerve damage from a crash. The doctors said sell the bike. Insurance said the same thing. A pause. I'd been riding for 28 years. Brandon said nothing. You know what riding is to someone who's been doing it for 28 years? It's not a hobby. It's not transportation. It's the one thing that's been consistent when everything else wasn't. He looked at his hands. When they told me I was done, I drove home from the clinic and sat in my truck in the driveway for 2 hours. Couldn't make myself go inside. Tyler looked at him. Brandon looked at him. Then someone told me about North Road Garage, about Emile Moreau. George looked at Celeste, who was working at the far bench and not appearing to listen, though Brandon had noticed by now that Celeste always heard everything. He looked at my arm and asked me to show him what range of motion I had. He asked me questions for 20 minutes and wrote things down. Then he said he thought he could modify the controls enough that I could ride within my limitations instead of being stopped by them. He paused. He charged me 1/3 of what it cost him in time and materials. I didn't ask him to. He just did. Brandon was still. Emile Moreau didn't repair my motorcycle, George said. He gave me back something I'd already said goodbye to. That's what that bike in the corner represents to people in this community. So when I tell you that scratching that tank and breaking that mirror isn't something I can look at lightly, I need you to understand I'm not talking about property damage. I'm talking about what it costs people to build what they built, and what it means when someone walks up and treats it like it's nothing. He looked at Brandon steadily and then looked away, the look of someone who has said what they came to say and has no interest in repeating it. Brandon looked at the floor. He looked at the Softail in the corner. Something moved across his face that hadn't been there in the parking lot. Not remorse yet, but the earlier thing that comes before remorse. When you finally begin to see the actual size of what you did, because someone has described it in a language that reaches somewhere below the surface. He picked up his broom. He swept differently after that. Celeste noticed. She noticed the way she noticed everything, without making a production of it, without recording it as a victory. She just registered it and moved on. What she didn't notice, because she was busy, and because she had spent years not spending much attention on her own circumstances when other people's were in front of her, was the envelope in the desk drawer. It had arrived 10 days earlier. She'd read it once, put it away, and hadn't looked at it since. Rex found it when he stopped by on a Wednesday afternoon to drop off a set of donated fork seals and waited in the office while Celeste was in the back bay. The drawer had been open. He read it. He put it back. He waited for her to bring it up. She didn't. The letter was from a property management company in Calgary. The building that housed North Road Garage had been purchased the previous spring. The letter was formal notification that the current lease would not be renewed at the end of the 30-day notice period. The company's plans for the site were, the letter explained in the bloodless language common to these things, not compatible with the current use of the property. 30 days. Either she found a new arrangement in a market that had moved well above what the garage generated, or she closed. The garage that Pierre Levine would ride again because of. The garage where George Pelletier had gotten his life back. The garage that Emile Moreau had built out of nothing over 31 years by showing up for people who needed it and never making them feel small for the needing. Rex came back on a Friday evening after the 4 young men had left for the day and found Celeste locking up. "When were you going to tell me?" he said. She looked at him. She knew immediately. "I was going to handle it," she said. "Alone. That's generally how I handle things." Celeste. He said her name the way you say a name when you need the person standing in front of you to actually receive what follows. "This garage isn't just yours. You know that. The people who've been through here, it belongs to more than one person. I know who it affects. That's why I wasn't talking about it. Because if you talked about it," Rex said, "people would want to help." She was quiet. "You've spent 3 years making sure everyone who walked through that door had what they needed," he said. "You want to explain to me why that only goes one direction?" She didn't argue. "I'm not comfortable needing things," she said finally. "I know that about you. I've known that since you were 19 years old, and the clutch cable snapped on your dad's truck 20 kilometers from town, and you wouldn't let anyone radio for help until you'd spent an hour trying to improvise something yourself." He pushed off the truck. "You've got 28 days. Stop handling it alone." He got into his truck. "I'll make some calls." Celeste stood in the gravel lot, with her keys in her hand, and thought about her father, who had told her once that the hardest skill he ever learned wasn't how to give, it was how to receive. She had never been good at that part. Inside, in the corner of the dark garage, Emile Softail waited. What Rex set in motion over the following 10 days moved the way things move in communities built on loyalty, not through announcements or formal channels, but through a word passed hand to hand, rider to rider, the way a flame moves when the conditions are right and there's plenty to catch. He called 7 people. Each of those 7 called others. Pierre Levine called Rex directly. He'd heard about a gathering being planned through a writer he didn't know well, who'd heard through someone he did. Pierre said he wanted to speak if that was all right. He'd been writing for 2 months. He wanted people to know what that meant. A woman named Ruth Saulnier called on a Thursday. Her voice was composed, but Rex could hear the effort behind the composure. She said she hadn't talked publicly about what Celeste and Emile's garage had done for her because it had felt too personal. She said she was ready now. A man named Martin called from 2 towns over. He'd been broken down on the highway 3 years ago with no signal, and a truck had pulled over, and the woman driving it had found the fault in his electrical system inside an hour and hadn't accepted a cent. He'd learned who she was 6 months later through a mutual acquaintance. Rex stopped counting calls at 19. The gathering was held on a Saturday. Celeste had been told it was a small thing. A few dozen riders, some of the people she'd worked with informal. Rex said she should come at 2 and not worry about setup. She arrived at 2:15, finishing a valve adjustment she didn't cut short. What she found was not a small thing. Vehicles stretched down the access road toward the highway. Riders from chapters she recognized and at least one she didn't. Veterans in their caps. People whose names she knew, and people she'd helped once and never seen again. Pierre Levine was near the front, standing beside his motorcycle, which he had ridden here on controls she had fabricated from scratch. Ruth Saulnier raised a hand when Celeste came out. George Pelletier stood with his cane, and the expression of a man who has witnessed many things, and intends to be fully present for this one. Celeste sat in her truck for 30 seconds, then she got out. Rex found her before she'd walked 20 feet. "You said small," she said. "I said a gathering. Small was your assumption." He steered her toward the front. Rex was not a man who gave speeches. He was a man who said what he meant and stopped when he'd said it. which meant the few times in his life he'd held a microphone, the words carried specific weight. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Celeste. Most of you know Celeste Moreau, he said. Some of you know her from the road. Some of you came to her for help with your vehicles. Some of you knew her father first, which meant you came to know her from a direction that already told you something. He paused. What most of you don't know, because she has never once told any of you, is the full picture of what North Road Garage has been doing for the past 3 years, and what it means that we may be 30 days from losing it. He stepped back. Pierre came forward. He walked with the slightly deliberate gait of someone who has made peace with their body working differently than it used to, and he held the microphone with his right hand, because his left had its limitations. 2 years ago I was told I was done riding, he said. His voice was steady. He'd had time to practice saying this. I believed it for about 16 months. Then someone told me to drive out to North Road. He looked at Celeste. She looked at my hand for about 20 seconds and said she thought she could work with it. Not she'd try. She thought she could work with it. Like the problem was already solved in her head and just needed confirming in her hands. He stopped. I rode here today. First time I'd been on a bike in 2 years before that. Every single time I still need a minute when I get off. His voice caught very slightly, and he let it catch without trying to hide it. She gave that back to me, and she never once made me feel like I owed her anything for it. He stepped back. Ruth Saulnier came forward. She held the microphone with both hands. My husband Gordon and I had a motorcycle together, she said. He died 4 years ago. After the funeral, my son drove down from Edmonton and said, Mom, sell the bike. You never rode it yourself. You don't need it sitting there. And he wasn't wrong. But I couldn't. Every time I thought about selling it, I felt like I was letting Gordon go in a way I wasn't ready for. So it sat. A pause. Then I drove out to North Road. Celeste came and looked at the bike and looked at me, and she asked me one question. She said, do you want to ride it or do you want it to run? I said I didn't know the difference. She said, one means you maintain it. The other means you learn it. Ruth looked at the crowd, not at Celeste, not yet. I have my license now. I've been riding for 3 years. Last summer, my son drove down and we rode the Crow's Nest Pass together. He hasn't mentioned selling the bike since. She stopped. When she started again, her voice was quiet. Celeste didn't fix a motorcycle. She showed me there was still a road available to me. I didn't know I needed someone to show me that. Celeste stood at the edge of the crowd and did not look away from Ruth's face and did not let herself manage what she was feeling down to something more presentable. She let it be there. It was large and complicated and moved through her chest in a way that had no clean name. Rex came back to the microphone. There's something I've been sitting on, he said. Something I want to say in front of everyone here, including Celeste, because she doesn't know this part. Celeste looked at him. Emile Moreau, Rex said, was not just Celeste's father. For many of the riders standing here today, Emile Moreau was the man who made it possible for them to ride in the first place. He let that settle. In the 90s, Emile ran an informal shop out of that same building his daughter runs now. Anybody who was broke and needed work done and couldn't afford a proper shop, Emile was where you went. He didn't advertise. He didn't set a rate. You brought what you had and he did what the bike needed. Rex paused. A good portion of the riders you see standing here today have a road in their past that went through North Road Garage before it went anywhere else. Emile Moreau put them there. The crowd was absolutely still. Celeste Moreau, Rex said, has spent 3 years doing exactly what her father did. She didn't know she was continuing a legacy because nobody sat her down and explained what her father had built. His voice shifted just slightly. She just did what felt right, the same way he did. Celeste pressed one hand briefly against her mouth. She was not going to fall apart in front of this many people. She was not built for falling apart publicly. But she let the thing move through her and she didn't shut it down, because she was getting better at that. Slowly, imperfectly. She had not known this. She had known her father helped people. She had not known the scale of it. She had not known that the riders standing in this field had roads in their past that ran through Emile Moreau's garage before they ran anywhere else. Brandon Kohler was in the crowd near the back. He had come because Celeste had mentioned the gathering, and he had come because by now his presence at things connected to North Road Garage felt less like obligation and more like something he hadn't yet found the right word for. He stood and listened. And he thought about a parking lot on Route 1. He thought about 10 minutes of his key against paint, and the way it had felt like power and how he understood now, with a clarity that was genuinely uncomfortable, that what he'd been performing power over was not an old motorcycle at a Tim Hortons. It was this, all of this, every person in this field, every story that had just been told, the 3 years of quiet work that had produced them. He started moving through the crowd before he knew he was going to. People made space for him, not warmly, but they made it. He felt their awareness of him as he moved through. He didn't stop. Rex saw him coming. He stepped back. Brandon Kohler had never held a microphone in a room where the audience wasn't already disposed to like him. He'd held phones. He'd stood in front of cameras. He'd performed. This was different. 200 people who had just spent an hour learning the shape of what he had damaged were looking at him, and he had nothing to perform. The performance instinct had, somewhere in the past 4 weeks in a garage outside Coleridge, begun to feel like a coat that no longer fit. He held the microphone. He looked at Celeste. "I wanted people to watch me," he said. His voice was even. He wasn't asking for anything, not sympathy, not absolution, not understanding. He was stating a fact about himself he had finally stopped being able to avoid. That's what I was doing. I wanted an audience, and I wanted the reaction. And I hadn't spent 30 seconds thinking about what it cost, because I had never been asked to think about what anything cost. He stopped. "I think about it now. Every day." He looked at Celeste. "I can't give back what we took. I know that. I'm not standing here saying I can make it like it didn't happen because it happened. But I want the people here to see what comes next. I want them to watch us put it back together." He lowered the microphone. He looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him with an expression that held several things at once: caution, assessment, and something that wasn't quite approval but was closer to it than anything Brandon had received from a man like Rex McGuire before. The crowd looked at Celeste. She didn't rush it. "All right," she said, "but we're not hiding what happened." Brandon waited. "When the tank is restored," she said, "you'll know where the scratch was. We're not covering it with fresh paint and pretending. We're restoring it. Which means anyone who looks at that motorcycle afterward can see exactly where it was damaged and exactly what was done to bring it back." Brandon looked at her. "Why?" "Because accountability doesn't mean erasing the past," she said. "It means deciding what you build after it. A repair that tells the truth is worth more than a perfect surface." The field was quiet. "The scratch stays visible," Celeste said, "and so does the work." Brandon nodded once. "Okay." Something in the field outside Coleridge on that Saturday afternoon changed in a way that wasn't dramatic, wasn't announced, wasn't performed for anyone's camera. It just changed. The way real things change, quietly, in front of witnesses, with the full weight of what came before it still present and acknowledged. The restoration of Emil's Softail took 3 weeks. Brandon worked the tank. He had never done bodywork before. Celeste walked him through the prep stages, the compound work, the patience the process required, and then left him to it. The scratch was surface, hadn't gone through the base coat. The repair was about restoring color and clarity, not repainting. Detail work. The kind that either teaches you what careful means or defeats you. Brandon wasn't defeated. Scott handled the mechanical assessment with a systematic thoroughness no one had predicted. He produced a condition report on the engine more detailed than Celeste had asked for, cross-referenced against the service manual he'd found on his own. By the end of the second day, he'd flagged the primary chain as worn, and brought the finding to Celeste without waiting to be asked. "Order it through the parts account," she said. "The login's on the desk." He nodded and went to find it. Dylan, quietly, without drawing attention to it, found a section of wiring under the tank mount where the insulation had cracked from years of heat cycling. It hadn't failed yet, it would have. He came to Celeste and described what he'd found. "Good catch," she said. "Do it right, take your time." He went back to it. The young man who had circled a motorcycle with his phone narrating damage for an invisible audience was now lying on the floor with his hands inside a wiring loom, making sure the motorcycle didn't fail the woman who was about to ride it. Celeste noticed. She didn't say anything about it. She didn't need to. Jamie worked the chrome. He found the rhythm early, patient, methodical, checking when uncertain rather than guessing. One afternoon near the end of the second week, he asked her, without preamble, what the hardest part had been after her father died. She sat down. "The ordinary thing," she said. "First morning I made coffee and didn't make 2 cups automatically. First time I drove past somewhere he would have liked and reached for my phone before I remembered." Jamie was quiet. "I lost someone too," he said. "Last year. I haven't been dealing with it the way I should. I've been staying busy. Always doing something, always around people, never sitting still." He stopped. "Because sitting still is when it finds you." "Yeah," Celeste said. "It is." She didn't tell him it would get easier. She'd had enough people tell her that in the past 11 weeks, to know the words were well-meant and mostly useless. "The rear brake needs calibration tomorrow," she said. "Come in early if you want. I'll walk you through it." He came in at 6:40 and made the coffee before she arrived. The word from Calgary came on a Tuesday morning. Rex called while Celeste was at the workbench. "The development company is willing to talk," he said. Anita looked at their project layout. "There's a rear parcel, about 60% of the current footprint, that isn't load-bearing for what they're planning. She thinks we can structure a long-term lease on that parcel at a rate the garage can carry." Celeste was quiet. The building's on the 60%? The building's on the 60%. She sat down on the stool near the parts bins. How did you get them to this? Anita is very good at what she does. Also, Pierre made some calls, and one of those reached someone who sits on a municipal committee the development company needs on site for another project. Business communities are small. A pause. There's one more thing. A veteran support network out of Calgary reached out to the company after someone forwarded them an account of what North Road has been doing for adaptive riders. Corporations with real estate portfolios are sensitive to those conversations. Anita used it carefully. Celeste looked at the garage around her. The organized tool cabinet, the sorted parts bins, the chrome work Jamie had spent hours on. The wiring loom Dylan had repaired properly, better in that section than it had been before any of this started. And at the center of all of it, Emil's Softail, almost finished, waiting for its seat. Rex, she said. Don't. I was going to say thank you. I know, don't. A pause. There's one more thing. The Veterans Network wants to talk about a formal partnership, funding for adaptive controls, equipment, possibly a second location eventually. They've been looking for a facility with a track record. He stopped. Celeste, your program is exactly what they've been looking for. They just didn't know it existed because you never made noise about it. She looked out the window. Brandon was at the workbench, bent over the tank with a polishing cloth, working with the careful attention of someone who has discovered that precision demands something real and has decided to find out what he's got. Set up the call, she said. The seat came back from Owen Gallant, 73 years old, semi-retired upholsterer who had spent 4 decades working leather on everything from saddle repairs to vintage aircraft interiors, and who had known Emil from the early years. When Celeste had called to describe the damage, Owen had been quiet on the phone for a moment and then said, "Bring it by." He'd done the work right. The seam was there, visible, exactly as she'd asked, a slightly raised line where the cut had been. The leather on either side matched as close as 30-year-old hide could be matched. Very close, but not perfectly close. The honest answer. The only answer worth giving. When Celeste unwrapped it on the workbench and set it under the shop light, the room went quiet. Brandon stood beside her and looked at it. It looks like it survived something, he said. Yes, Celeste said. It does. She ran her fingers along the seam. She thought about her father's hands on this leather for 30 years. She thought about every road the machine had carried him down, and every ordinary Tuesday it had made less ordinary. She set it back down carefully. "We're close," she said. "How close?" She looked at the motorcycle. Tank restored, chrome finished, engine reassembled, wiring clean throughout, brakes new, chain replaced. She looked at the seat. "Tomorrow," she said, "maybe less." The seat went on the following afternoon. Celeste did it herself. She lifted it and felt its weight. Elmore's careful work, the seam under her palm, and she positioned it over the mount and heard the latches catch, and kept her hands on it for a moment after, not pressing, just resting. Brandon was standing 3 feet away. He understood by now which moments didn't need narration. Celeste lifted her hands. She stepped back. Emil Moreau's 1989 Harley-Davidson Softail stood complete in the center of North Road Garage for the first time in 12 weeks. Brandon let out a long breath. Dylan put his hands on the back of his neck. Jamie looked at Celeste's face. Scott said quietly, "To no one in particular, that's it." "That's it," Celeste agreed. She walked a slow circuit around the motorcycle, looking at every surface. She crouched at the left side and looked at the tank repair from an angle. She looked at the pipes, at the chrome, at the seat from the side, the seam catching the shop light in a thin raised line that told the truth about what had happened and what had been done about it. She put her hand on the handlebar. The grip was room temperature. She stood there with her hand on it, and the garage held its breath. Then Rex's truck pulled into the lot. They rolled the Softail out through the bay door together, Brandon at the left handlebar, Jamie at the right, Scott and Dylan steadying the rear with the care of people who understood what they were moving and had earned the right to be part of moving it. The November morning air came in cold and clear, and Celeste blinked against the light. The lot was full. Riders she'd known for years and riders she'd met once, veterans in their caps and their particular stillness. Pierre Levine near the front, standing beside his own motorcycle. Ruth Saulnier with her hand raised. George Pelletier with his cane, and the expression of someone who intends to carry this day for the rest of his life. Owen Gallant had driven over from his place outside town, the first time Celeste could remember seeing him at the garage rather than the other way around. Rex stood in the center of all of it. He looked at the motorcycle. He looked at Celeste. He didn't say a word, and he didn't need to. Celeste stood beside the Softail and looked out at the people who had come. At the riders she'd ridden beside and the customers she'd worked for and the people whose names she'd never asked because asking names had never been the point. At Pierre, who had ridden here today on controls she'd built from scratch. At Ruth, who had her license now. At George, standing straight despite the cane. At Brandon, Jamie, Scott, and Dylan, standing slightly apart from everyone else, somewhere in the threshold between outside and in, which was exactly where they'd earned to be. Rex came and stood beside her. He looked at the tank. "You know what your father said to me the first time he got this bike running?" he said quietly. "He called me from the road. February. He'd been working on it for 6 weeks, and when I picked up he could barely talk, he was so pleased with himself." Rex paused. He said, "Rex, some things just need you to stay with them long enough. That's all they need." Celeste looked at him. "He said that about the motorcycle?" "He said that about everything. The motorcycle was just the example." Rex took his hand off the tank. "You stayed with it." She pressed her lips together. She had decided, at approximately 6:30 this morning, that she was not going to cry in front of this many people. She intended to honor that decision. "Ready?" Rex asked. She looked at Emil's motorcycle, at the tank restored, the seam on the seat, the small imperfections on the right side pipes that he had called the map. "I've been ready for 12 weeks, she said. She swung her leg over. The motorcycle settled under her the way a thing settles when it belongs to you and you belong to it. That specific conversation between a rider and a machine that happens below the level of conscious thought, in the hands and the hips and the balance. She felt the handlebar grips. She felt the seat beneath her, the restored leather, the honest seam. And she thought about her father sitting in this exact position on this exact machine for 31 years of Alberta roads and winter mornings, and every ordinary Tuesday that had been made less ordinary by the fact of being on this bike. She put her hand on the throttle. She hit the start. The engine turned over once, caught and came alive. The sound moved through the crowd the way the vibration of approaching engines had moved through the soles of her boots 12 weeks ago in a parking lot on Route 1. Not just heard, but felt in the chest, in the hands, in the place where people keep the things that matter to them. Pierre put his fist to his mouth. Ruth closed her eyes for a second. George Pelletier stood with his cane and his straight back, and the expression of someone who has witnessed something they will carry for the rest of their life. Rex turned away for a moment, just a moment, nobody mentioned it. Celeste sat on the running motorcycle and let it run, and she listened to it the way her father had taught her to listen. Not as noise, but as information. As the accumulated voice of everything the machine had been through and was still impossibly carrying forward. Behind her, engines were starting. One, then several, then a dozen, then the full sound of the lot coming alive. The collective voice of bikes waking up. A sound that was enormous and somehow intimate. The sound of a community gathered around a single purpose on a November morning in Alberta. She looked over her shoulder and found Brandon. He was standing near the back of the crowd, with his hands at his sides and his face open in a way she had never once seen it in the parking lot that night. Not performing, not calculating, just present, just there. "You coming?" she said. The crowd between them made space without being asked. Brandon walked forward and stopped beside the motorcycle. "I don't have my bike here," he said. "I know. I'm not asking you to ride." She looked at him steadily. "I'm asking if you're coming Monday, 6:30. He recognized the number. The ongoing negotiation of their early mornings, the time that had been moving earlier and earlier as the weeks went on, as he'd started arriving before his hours required and staying after they ended, as North Road Garage had become the place he came to, rather than the place he was obligated to appear. "Make it 6:15, he said. Something moved in her expression, brief and real. 6:15, she agreed. Then she turned back to the road. Rex had already kicked his bike to life. He was at her left, the position he'd ridden for years beside Emile Moreau, and he was looking at the highway with the patience of someone who has been waiting a long time for a moment to arrive and is now allowing himself the full experience of it arriving. Celeste put the Softail in gear. She pulled out of the lot slowly, the way Emile had always pulled out, checking both directions, no hurry, because the road deserved that much. She came onto the access road and then the highway, and she felt the motorcycle settle into the pace of real movement, the different quality of a machine doing what it was built to do. Behind her she heard them coming, Rex first, then riders she could almost identify by sound, then the larger sound of the group taking shape, engines finding their spacing, the rhythm of a ride establishing itself the way it always did, organically without direction, because riders know how to do this the way birds know how to form a flock. The Tim Hortons appeared, on the right at the 2-kilometer mark. The parking lot where everything had started, the gravel, the hydro pole, the particular light of a November evening, when 3 young men had decided that something was available to them that wasn't. She felt the pull of it, the symbolic gravity of that lot, the logic of returning, of completing the circle, the way stories are supposed to complete their circles. She felt it, and she rode past it. The lot went by on her right, and she kept her eyes on the road ahead, on the highway opening in front of her, on the direction that wasn't back. She heard Rex's engine steady beside her. She heard him understand. He didn't signal, didn't call out. He just rode on, steady and present and without waste, the way he always rode. The rest of them followed. Because that was what this was, not a return. Not a reckoning performed for the memory of a parking lot. Not a circle completed for the satisfaction of the story. This was a ride. This was a woman on her father's motorcycle on a cold November morning in Alberta, with the people behind her who had come because of who she was, not because of what had been done to her. The Tim Hortons got smaller in the mirror. Then it was gone. Celeste opened the throttle. The Softail gave her everything it had, fully and without holding back, the way Emile had always said it would if you treated it right. She rode through the cold, bright morning, and she didn't think about development companies or lease agreements, or the phone call scheduled for Thursday, or the 4 young men whose court hours had ended, but who kept showing up early. She didn't think about the 30 days that had nearly taken everything, or the weeks of work that had brought the bike back. She just rode. She let her father be present with her on the highway where he'd ridden for 31 years. Let him be in the engine sound and the handlebar vibration, and the weight of the machine he had maintained and loved, and finally, impossibly, left to her, along with everything else he'd left her, the garage, the community, the legacy she hadn't known existed until Rex stood at a microphone and told her about it in front of 200 people. Some things that are broken should not be hidden. Some repairs are more honest for the seam they leave behind. The most true things in this world carry their damage where it can be seen and move forward anyway, not despite what happened to them, but with it, because it is part of them now, part of every road they've survived. Emile Moreau had known that. He'd tried to teach it with oil-stained Saturday mornings and long Alberta highways and conversations his daughter had thought were about motorcycles. She understood now that they had never been about motorcycles. She understood it on the road, with his engine beneath her, and the people behind her, and the cold November sky overhead, the same sky he'd ridden under, the same province, the same particular quality of light when everything is still possible, and the things that matter have already, quietly been built. She rode. And the road held her the way it had held him before her, the way it holds everyone willing to stay with it, long enough to understand what they're riding toward.